There's a fine line between an interview and a conversation. And a lot of good podcast conversations are introduced as interviews.
Your podcast should be your most powerful business development tool, a trust and authority builder, and your content creation engine. Let's help your podcast help your business with the Story Trust Media Podcast. Here's your host, John Gehring.
Most episodes that I hear start with introducing a guest and saying, "Hey, welcome to my interview with so-and-so. Thanks for having me on the show," the person says. "I'm really excited for this conversation." The host says it's an interview. The guest says it's a conversation. Which is it? Because the difference matters. Good podcast interviews are conversations. Bad podcast interviews are simply interviews. Let's talk about the difference. A podcast interview, or any interview from a journalistic point of view, is when the host is simply there to facilitate responses from the interviewee. "Hey, tell me A, B, or C." The interviewee answers the question. "Hey, I would love to hear more about this." The interviewee answers the question. Think of, since it's about that time of year when basketball is really popular and the NBA playoffs and everything is happening, the halftime interviews or the post-game interviews when the host goes down on the court and says, "Hey, coach, tell me about the last 2 minutes of play there. Tell me about this player's performance." It's a question that's only purpose is to lead to an answer. It's not a question to facilitate more thinking, a question to add value for the audience, a question that allows the interviewee to engage in a more one-to-one conversation. No, it's simply, "Hey, here's a mic. Let me literally stick it in your face. Ask you this question. Now, 3, 2, 1, go. Floor is yours." And there's nothing wrong with an interview in sports, certainly in news when you're trying to get the information across to the audience. But in most podcasts, when you have a guest on, it's still your show. You're still looking to establish authority and trust with your audience. So an interview doesn't actually do you a lot of good. But there's a fine line between an interview and a conversation. And a lot of good podcast conversations are introduced as interviews. So again, big difference here. What's a conversation? Well, there's nothing that says a conversation can't follow an interview-like style, where the host is asking the guest questions, drawing more out of them, facilitating more conversation. But the difference between a conversation and an interview is, yes, certainly how much the host is involved, but also the host's purpose within that conversation. It's not just to tee the guest up, to offer the guest a platform and tee them up with a question that will help them make a point. It's to add value themselves too. It's actually to challenge the guest sometimes in ways that they weren't expecting. See, too often, podcast interviews that should actually be conversations but are just interviews feature a host that is way too friendly to their guest. A host that is simply scared of asking a guest a hard question. A host that just thinks that podcasting is all about staying out of the way and featuring this great guest so that their audience benefits. And they're half right. The importance of your guest in delivering value to your audience is essential. But the importance of you still establishing yourself as an authority and as part of the conversation, not just the facilitator and the owner of the platform, is equally important. So how do you do that? Number one, add value. Don't have a list of questions. Don't go down the list. In fact, every time I have a podcast and I have an interview or a radio segment interview with somebody and they come on, they say, "Can I get a list of the questions you're going to ask?" I say, "No, because I don't have one." Now, I can tell you how we're going to start the conversation and the first question I'm going to ask. And I can even tell you a couple questions that I have in the back of my mind that'll come up as a fail safe if the conversation stalls, but we might not get to them. I can tell you about the topics that I want to cover. But no, when it comes to a real conversation, not an interview, there's no list of questions. There's a direction the conversation needs to head in. There may be some, like I said, some fallback questions in case the conversation stalls, but there's no concrete list of questions. That would be an interview, not a conversation. So again, don't script anything, just add value. How does that sound? Your guest gives a great question, a great answer to one of your questions. You can say, oh, I this really resonates with me because be your listener's representative in that podcast conversation. If you're learning from the guest too, great. That's one of the benefits of podcasting. But be like the listener. React like your listener would react. Oh, I never thought of that. That's such a great point. And then add value by saying, I think I could use this in such and such situation. Now your audience goes, oh, you know what? Maybe I could too. And not only that, but you become more relatable to your audience because you're putting yourself in their shoes and more value is delivered. Not, okay, thank you for answering question number 1. Here's question number 2. Not a dynamic conversation. And it doesn't add value or establish yourself as a trusted authority for your audience, which again is ultimately the goal. So, number 1, add value. Number 2, don't script the questions. I was just talking about that, right? The importance of being able to go off on a different trail if the interview or the conversation, as I would rather say, takes you in that direction, right? Let yourself go in that direction. Or simply don't overthink the questions. Don't think that you can't pry for more. Don't think that, okay, they answered that question. Now I got to move on to the next one. There's nothing wrong as a podcast interviewer with saying, tell me more about that. If they're a good podcast guest, they should. If they're a good podcast guest, they'll dive deeper. Let's dig deeper into that. There's nothing wrong with that. Because again, in an interview, it's a transactional question, answer, question, answer. In a conversation, you might say that. If you don't quite get the answer you're satisfied with, you might say in an average everyday conversation, tell me more. Let's dig deeper. So why can't you in a podcast conversation? So don't script the questions and allow for follow-ups or allow a completely different change of direction if they strike a nerve with you. Now, this takes some skilled interviewing. And I know that early on in your podcasting journey, you might not be comfortable with totally changing the trajectory of your conversation. And you want to be careful because you want to make sure you don't totally change the trajectory to a point where now you're not providing value or solving a problem that your audience has anymore. And now you're talking about, I don't know, European travel or something. Like you got to be careful with that. But if you have those skills and that experience, don't be afraid to take the podcast conversation in a different direction. So again, number 1, add value as the host. You're not just there to ask questions, you're there to add value and build trust. Number 2, don't script the questions. And number 3, tell stories. Stories are so powerful. People connect with stories. And as a host, you're not just there to facilitate the storytelling of your guest. Why aren't you there to tell stories of your own? Because again, when you add value, when you put yourself in the listener's shoes and you realize that what might be coming up in their minds should be spoken, you make yourself more relatable to them and you make it more of a conversation than an interview. So tell stories. Tell a story of what a guest's response made you think of, or what a guest's story made you think of a time in your life. This is how conversation flows, right? Now, not to get my old grumpy man hat on, but I do believe that in our society, we've lost a lot of the art of conversation. And part of that art is storytelling. I'm not the greatest storyteller in the world. I understand that. I can work on it just as much as anyone can. But the power of stories is undeniable, whether you're a good storyteller or not. So don't suppress your stories as a podcast host just because the guest is supposed to have the floor, or so you think. Yes, you're spotlighting your guest, but this is a time for you to add value too. So add value, don't script, tell stories. You do those three things, your podcast interview is not simply an interview. It's a real conversation that builds trust.
Thanks for checking out the Story Trust Media podcast. Learn more about what Story Trust Media can do for your business and book a free consultation at storytrust.media.